Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the economy in China, and specifically to talk about the growing exodus of companies that are now leaving China. Now, interestingly, China is one of the biggest markets in the world. They've got 1.4 billion people. So, up until recently, it was actually the largest country in the world. It was recently overtaken by India, but it's still pretty massive. And when you're thinking as a corporate, normally you're looking to take on markets like that, go over there, set up your facilities, and then start selling lots of your product directly to all of the consumers. And if we take Russia as a good example, that's what happened in the early 1990s when Russia opened itself up to the rest of the world. Lots of American businesses went over and set up joint ventures or just set up standalone facilities and started selling into the Russian market. And as you know, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, most of those companies have now left Russia. They've decided that they no longer want to sell to Russian individuals, and so they've abandoned the market. But China is quite different because China is a low labour economy. So the consumers in China historically didn't have a lot of free income to be able to buy things that were produced by Western companies. So companies from the West and the USA particularly look to China to make things, to manufacture things. And in order to highlight that point, this table shows the US companies with the largest revenue in China in 2024. And as you can see right at the top of this list is Apple, which obviously is a consumer branded business. And the reason why Apple is so successful in China is because the middle class, which is now a large part of the community, wants to buy Western products. And Apple iPhones are one of the must-have products. And in 2024, Apple achieved revenue of almost $70 billion. So it's doing very well. However, when you look at the rest of this list, the only other branded business is Tesla, which has operations in China and sells cars in the same sort of way as Apple is selling phones. It's a must-have, very trendy, state-of-the-art product that lots of Chinese middle classes want to own. But apart from Apple and Tesla, the other companies on this list are all producing things that are used in business. So we've got Qualcomm, Intel, Nvidia, Broadcom, Applied Materials, Lam Research, and Monolithic Power Systems, all of whom are producing semiconductors. So they're making something which is then used in China to produce something else. So it's a component rather than being a finished branded product. So the Chinese market is quite different to most other global markets where you go in and want to establish your brand. In China, it's really a manufacturing base. And one of the reasons why US and other international companies went to China in the 80s and 90s and noughties was firstly because it was very cheap in terms of labour, a lot cheaper than producing in your home country. Also, China started to build significant infrastructure so it could move huge volumes of products all around the country. It also had good ports, so it was able to then export all of those products. It had good logistics, so it was able to manage the movement of all of those products to know exactly where those cargoes were at any one time. And then it also had good incentives. So the Chinese authorities offered tax breaks and lots of attractive features for companies to go in and set up huge facilities. So there are a lot of really good reasons to start using China 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. However, the landscape has now changed entirely. Now, before we go on any further today, I want to talk to you about strawberry.me that offers certified personal online coaching services. And I've been using Colleen at strawberry.me for the past couple of months and found it to be fantastically helpful. If you're at a crossroads or at a rut, you're just stuck, you can't really move forward, you don't know how to move things on in your life or your career, then you should consider personal coaching because this isn't therapy. They're not going to talk to you about what's happened in the past. You're just looking forward, working out a plan and then setting achievable goals that you'll be measured against and you'll have somebody to talk to about. It's like having a personal coach. And that's basically what it is. Because I think in life, we don't invest enough into ourselves. It's far too easy to get caught up in the day-to-day routine, constantly thinking about what you need to do next, what you're doing this afternoon. You don't get that opportunity to take a step back and think, where do I want to go? Where do I want to be in 6 months or 6 years' time. And having a personal coach will help you to achieve that. And I've managed to secure a $50 credit for you. So go to strawberry.me/Joe Blogs or scan the QR code on the screen now or click the link in the description below and start your personal coaching journey today. Now, if you've been following the channel, you'll know that since Donald Trump took over in his second term in office, he's launched a trade war with China. He's actually launched a trade war with lots of different countries. He's introduced tariffs on all imports into the USA. But China has been at the sharp end of this trade war. He initially introduced a 10% tariff, he doubled that to 20%, and then subsequently increased it to 145%. Now, I don't for a second believe that that 145% will stay in place for much longer than it needs to. It certainly won't be the permanent tariff for all Chinese imports, because that would cause major problems in the US economy during the rest of 2025. So I am sure that Donald Trump is using this as a negotiating tactic. However, China isn't playing ball at the moment. They haven't been knocking on the White House's door saying, please let us in and negotiate down your tariff. They've basically hit the US with 125% reciprocal tariff. So all the US exports that were going into China, of which there were around about $180 billion worth in 2024. So a meaningful amount of business for all of those companies that are exporting to China. That 125% tariff is going to kill all of that business for the foreseeable future. So I am sure there will be a deal negotiated at some point. However, what we've seen is that companies that are importing from China into the USA are going to struggle in the short term because, as it stands at the moment, those tariffs exist. So if you're a company, you certainly don't want to be bringing any product out of China into the USA at the moment. However, the latest tariffs aren't the first time that China have been hit with increased tariffs. This table shows all of the tariffs that have been introduced on imports from China into the USA, dating back to Donald Trump's first presidency, which started back in 2017. So you can see that in January 2018, a 30% tariff was introduced on solar panels, which was seen as being cheap and subsidized by the Chinese authorities at that time, and also a sliding scale of between 20 and 50% on washing machines. In May of 2018, a 25% tariff was introduced on steel and 10% on aluminium products. In July of that year, a further 25% tariff was introduced on a basket of $34 billion worth of Chinese goods. In August of 2018, a further $16 billion worth of goods were added to that list with a 25% tariff. And in September, a further $200 billion worth of goods were hit with a 10% tariff. And as you can see from the rest of this list, I won't go through it because I know that annoys a lot of people, albeit I'd be surprised if you could read all of the things on this list because the writing is quite small. But what you can see here is that over the last 7 years or so, the US has introduced a variety of tariffs on all sorts of different products, which have meant that importing those goods from China has become more expensive and therefore less attractive for US companies. And as a result of this, we are now starting to see US businesses deciding that China might not be the best option in terms of setting up your manufacturing base because you just don't know what's going to happen from a political point of view. It's no point going to China and sourcing things that are 50% cheaper than they are in the USA, and then those things being hit with a tariff of 145%, for example, because they then become much more expensive and defeat the whole purpose of outsourcing your manufacturing. Now, one of the main drivers historically for using China to produce your goods was because the cost of labour was very cheap, significantly cheaper than in the USA, but also significantly cheaper than in other low labour economies. However, that is no longer the case. This table compares the average labour cost in China with 9 other countries with a low labour cost environment. And as you can see, currently at the moment, the labour cost in China is around $6.50 to $8 per hour. And as it stands right now, around 30% of all manufacturing imports into the USA are made in China. And they're made up mostly of electronics, machinery, textiles, and toys. Now, if we compare that's $6.50 to $8 per hour, to the rest of the countries on this list, you can see that it's actually a lot cheaper in many of the other countries. In Mexico, where the USA derives 14% of its manufacturing imports, mostly automotive, electronics, and appliances, the average labour cost is less than $4 per hour. So that's roughly half of what it is in China right now. In Vietnam, where the US sources around 10% of its manufactured products, mostly apparel, footwear, and electronics, labour costs are around $3 per hour. So that's significantly cheaper than it is in China. And in India, average labour costs can be as low as $1.50 to $3 per hour. Now, currently, the USA is sourcing around 5% of its manufactured imports, and that's textiles, pharmaceuticals, and automotive parts. However, there is a big shift going on right now. And if we look at the rest of the countries on this list, Bangladesh, which provides around 3% of US imports, they provide a lot of socks into the USA, but a lot of other textiles and garments. Average labour costs can be as low as $1 per hour. Now, when you compare that to the USA, and I've talked about this a lot in recent videos, where Donald Trump wants to move all of the business back into the USA, it is going to be very difficult to find anybody in the US who's prepared to work for $1 per hour. In fact, it probably isn't even legal. I'm sure the labour laws would prevent you from paying somebody $1 per hour. Indonesia, average prices are around $1.50 to $2.50. Thailand, you're looking at paying people between $2.50 and $4. The Philippines, between $2 and $3. Pakistan, between $1 and $1.50 per hour. And that point is well made, I think, in terms of trying to find somebody in the US to replace those jobs that are in Pakistan. Obviously, you could automate a lot of things so that you wouldn't have to have many people in the factories, but there's going to be a high return on capital if you're making everything automated. And in Cambodia, it's between $1 and $1.50. And the point really of showing this chart is just to highlight the fact that China, relative to the rest of the world, is no longer the low-cost alternative. It's actually become more expensive from a people perspective to pay people in China than it is in all of these other countries. And that's one of the reasons why US companies and other international businesses are now relocating their manufacturing out of China to somewhere else. If you're running a business, the cost of labour isn't the only factor that you need to weigh up. You need to make sure that the people who are doing the job are skilled enough to be able to do it to the quality that you're looking for. So there's no point paying people a very low rate and then producing low quality product. That's just going to put you back to square one, because you're going to have to scrap all of that product and start again. And over the last 40 or 50 years, China has become very skilled in low cost labour. However, the rest of the world is now catching up. This table compares the 10 countries that we've just looked at in terms of the cost of labour and looks at their skilled rating. Now, China, as I said, is highly skilled, so it can produce things on a huge volume using lots of people. So we've given it a 3-star rating. And you've got a strong base of engineers, advanced manufacturing talent, and also lots of robotics that are now being used in Chinese factories. Second on this list is India, which we've given 2 stars to because it's got an excellence in IT and engineering and is growing its technical education sector. So India is coming up on the rails. It is fast catching up to China in terms of its skilled workforce. So we saw that it's a lot cheaper to use people in India, and those people are becoming more and more skilled. Mexico has a similar ranking to India because it's skilled in the automotive sector, electronics, and aerospace industries. So it's specialized in those different areas. And that's why a lot of US businesses are now using Mexican companies and Mexican manufacturing and Mexican people because they're good at doing what you need them to do. Thailand and the Philippines also rank equally with Mexico and India because they've got skills in electronics, automotive, and medical manufacturing, and are also highly educated. Now, the other countries on this list we've given 1 star to: Vietnam, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Cambodia. However, For certain things, for certain goods and products, you don't need to have a highly skilled workforce. So you can see here that these countries are good at producing garments and footwear and apparel. So they can be outsourced. All of those things can be outsourced without having a highly skilled workforce. And then the other items, you need to develop that skill. You need to build up all of those potential people to be able to do things that you want them to do. So what the point of this chart is really is to show that whilst China still ranks at the top, it does have the most skilled workforce and the best techniques. These other countries are rapidly catching up. And obviously, the best way to learn, the best way to develop your skills is to be given more business, to take on more people, to actually train them up. And over time, you'll also become skilled and maybe the price will go up. But at the moment, there is a large cost differential between all these countries and China. And the difference in terms of the skill base is narrowing. Now, having a low cost and skilled workforce isn't the only thing that you need in terms of setting up your manufacturing facility overseas. You also need to make sure that the product can be moved safely and on time to the ports and then exported. So you need good infrastructure, either good roads or good rail network or facilities that are located close to the ports. And this chart compares China to the other 9 countries that we've been looking at. And I've given China 3 stars here because it's got world-class highways, rails, ports, and mega industrial zones. So it's been set up to basically be a manufacturing country. That's what it's been designed to do. So it does have good networks. But also you can see here that Mexico, India, Indonesia, and Thailand also have good infrastructure. So Mexico has a strong US border infrastructure, industrial cities, and decent roads. So it's been following the same sort of model that China has built itself upon. It's been building these large factories and making sure that they've got good infrastructure to be able to move all of that product swiftly and efficiently. India is following a similar pattern, so it's setting up key hubs, but it still does have some uneven transport and utilities. So it isn't quite there yet in terms of being able to compete like for like with China. But as I said, it is a lot cheaper and it's growing its potential. So I'm sure over the next 5 to 10 years, India will catch up to China. Indonesia also has decent infrastructure in Java. However, the rest of the country is still quite remote and isn't as developed. So it's got a big hub at the moment in Java, but it needs really to start developing the rest of its infrastructure if it's going to compete like for like with countries like China and India. And Indonesia, it has a huge population. It's one of the most populous countries in the world. Thailand had solid roads, highways, airports, and transport systems, but again isn't quite on the same level as China or even Mexico at the moment. And then we've got the other countries, Vietnam, Bangladesh, the Philippines, Pakistan, and Cambodia, where we've got a developing situation. So there are some good roads and some decent rail networks. However, it's not quite as comprehensive as it is in the other countries. But the point of highlighting this is just to show the fact that it's not just the cost of labour and whether or not the people are skilled enough to be able to produce things. You need to make sure that you can actually move all of the product safely, get it to the port, and then get it out of the country. So once you've got your product to port, you need to make sure that that port is large enough to be able to cope with the volume of products that are moving through it, both inward and outward cargoes, and also that it's got the logistics and the capacity to be able to monitor exactly where everything is, to put it onto the right ships, to make sure that those ships are going to the right destination. So there's a lot involved in terms of what's going on at the ports. And this chart compares the 9 countries that we've just talked about against China. And as you can see, China once again ranks right at the top of this list. It's home to 7 of the world's 10 busiest container ports. Not surprisingly, because it's the manufacturing base for most of the world. So that's where most of these containers are actually originating from. That's where they're being filled up and then sent on to other countries. And it's also got world-class logistics and an efficient customs system. So it can process and move all of these goods in and out of the port really quickly. So you don't want weeks and weeks of hold up and paperwork and people not knowing where any of the cargo is or losing containers. You don't want want any of that if you're on a very tight schedule in terms of getting that ship to where it's going to. Because from China, a lot of these ports will wait 5, 6, 7, 8 weeks for those ships to actually arrive. So you can't have a hold up at the customs system, which is then causing major problems and then will have a knock on impact. And if we look at the other countries on this list, you can see that I've given Mexico, Thailand, India, and Indonesia 2 stars. So they're doing well in terms of their ports. They're not at the same level as China, but quite frankly, not many countries in the world are. And you can see that all of these countries have developed their ports over the past 20 years or so. And then we've got Vietnam, the Philippines, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Cambodia at the bottom, where they're still developing their capacity. They're still building out their ports. They may have 1 or 2 ports, but they don't have huge capacity to be able to take on the sort of volume of products that China is processing on a daily basis. But everybody's moving in the right direction. And you can see that Mexico, Thailand, India, and Indonesia are not far off being able to compete with China. Historically, one of the other reasons why companies went to China was because there were incentives on offer. So the Chinese authorities would offer grants or subsidies or tax-free zones or special development zones in order to encourage companies to go over and build their facilities. However, that's now happening with all of these other countries. And you can see from this table that I've just listed out some of the programs that are being offered. So you can see Mexico has the IMEX program, which is a duty-free import and export system. It also offers tax breaks and special economic zones near the border for the USA and support specifically for the automotive and aerospace industries. Vietnam provides tax exemptions for up to 4 years, reduced corporate tax of between 10 and 15%, and land lease reductions, and also has special economic zones. And India is now offering production-linked incentive schemes, tax cuts for manufacturing, also has special economic zones, and will do fast-track approvals. And you can see that the rest of the countries on this list are also offering similar sorts of incentives. So we've got more of a level playing field now in terms of most countries know that they need to encourage these companies to come in and set up their facilities, because once they've done that, they've got that business, they've got that employment for a long period of time. You're not going to countries like Vietnam and setting up a huge facility and then deciding within a couple of weeks that you're going to move on somewhere else. This is a long-term capital incentive that once you've set it up, you're going to have that facility there for the foreseeable future. So countries have realized that they need to offer these sorts of things. And interestingly, there's been a backlash against China over the past couple of years, particularly when we're talking about electric vehicles. We've seen the USA and the European Union introduce tariffs because they believe that the Chinese authorities have actually been subsidizing those industries too heavily to enable them to be able to sell their products at much cheaper prices around the rest of the world. So to level that off, we've now seen these tariffs being introduced. The USA's introduced a tariff of 100% on electric vehicles being imported from China. And that was before the 145% that Donald Trump introduced. So in terms of which companies are actually relocating out of China and where are they going, this table shows an example of some of the companies who've moved their manufacturing over recent years or have announced that they're going to. And as you can see at the top of this list, we've got Apple, who's moved from China to Vietnam and India. It's been diversifying its supply chain and now has 26 suppliers operating 28 factories in Vietnam. And the company's planning to increase its investments into Vietnam further. That was before Donald Trump announced that he was imposing a 90% tariff on all imports from Vietnam. There may be an exemption with regards to Apple and electronics. It's all a bit of a grey area at the moment. And also, I'm sure that Vietnam will negotiate that tariff down to a more acceptable level. So Apple initially saw its share price crashing when it was announced that that 90% tariff was being introduced. However, it has come back because I don't think realistically it's going to be 90%. Dell have moved their facilities from China to Mexico and Vietnam, and they're also now looking to potentially expand that. HP have moved to Mexico and Southeast Asia. Nike have moved their facilities to Vietnam. Foxconn have moved to India and Vietnam. Ericsson to India. flex steel to Vietnam and Mexico. So what we're seeing here is lots of US and international businesses moving their manufacturing bases out of China to other low labor cost countries for the reasons that we've discussed. And politically, I think there will probably be more of this because as we see the tension rising between the USA and China, there is a very real possibility that the tariffs could be increased at any time. So if you're a company and you're sourcing lots of your materials directly from China at the moment, the last thing that you want is to see a huge increase in costs just because of some political decision. So it probably makes sense from a business perspective to diversify where your manufacturing is located. And as we've talked about in today's video, there are now a lot of other countries that offer the same sort of benefits as China. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because there's been a lot of discussion about what's happening between the USA and China over the course of the last couple of months since Donald Trump took over as the president. And what we've seen is a trade war erupting. We've got tariffs as it stands at the moment. When I made this video, you never know, things can change within minutes or hours with Donald Trump. But at the time of making this video, the 145% tariff was still officially in place. There is some discussion about the two parties coming together and agreeing something lower, but as it stands, it is at that level. And that would absolutely kill your business if it does go through. If Apple was sourcing all of its outsourced manufacturing from China and the price of that increased by 145%, that would push the price of an iPhone above $3,000, which would obviously completely destroy Apple's business model and it would destroy all of its sales. So I don't think as a business owner you can run that risk. And what we've got here is a situation where companies are now looking at alternative options. Now, China 30 or 40 years ago was probably the no-brainer place to go because it was first to market. It was a low labour cost country that suddenly developed all of its infrastructure and was able to handle huge volumes of production at very low cost. And so that made it really attractive if you were a company that wanted to outsource your manufacturing because you could do it for a very low value. However, what we've seen over the course of the last 7 or 8 years, particularly in the USA, is that tariffs have started to be introduced on lots of imports from China because the US authorities believe that the Chinese authorities have been subsidizing a lot of the companies in China, and also because of the tension in terms of the trade deficit between the US and China. The US authorities have said they need to level the playing field. So from a company perspective, there are now real risks associated to having your manufacturing in China. And as a result of that, we've started to see companies moving away from China. They've decided to go to other low labour cost economies. And what we've seen over the past 10 to 15 years is that countries such as Mexico and India and the Philippines and Thailand have been developing their infrastructure, they've been improving their ports, they've been improving their logistics and improving their skill base so their people are now better at doing things. And that means that they're now competing with China on a like-for-like basis. And from a political point of view, there's less tension with most of those countries. Obviously, there's an issue at the moment between the USA and Mexico because of the fentanyl drug problem that Donald Trump has identified. He believes that a lot of that drug is moving into the USA through the Mexico border, and so he's applied this 25% tariff. But whether or not that remains in place, nobody really knows. But what this tells us is that over the last 10 years, we have seen US and other international companies starting to decide that they no longer want to source their manufacturing from China. And as it stands right now, we're seeing an acceleration in companies moving away from China to other low labour cost economies. And of course, the impact of all of this on the Chinese economy is going to be damaging because China has been benefiting from all of that employment, all of that investment over the last 30 or 40 years. And as that investment and employment starts to move to other countries, then China will see a reduction in its employment. It will see less people being paid, higher wages by overseas companies. And so this is going to prove a real challenge for the Chinese authorities at a time when the Chinese economy is already struggling. We've talked a lot about the property situation. The property market is completely shot at the moment. It's come right down. Lots of property development companies have become bankrupt and illiquid and disappeared, and the state have been nationalising lots of others. People have lost confidence in the property sector. So, manufacturing is a really important part of China's GDP. It accounted for 40% of GDP in the first quarter of 2025. And if we continue to see overseas companies deciding that they're moving out of China to other countries, that's going to reduce the amount of manufacturing in China. It'll reduce the profitability of that sector and therefore will drag down GDP. So, represents yet another challenge for China in terms of trying to achieve its 5% growth target for 2025. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. And thank you so much to everyone that's supporting the channel. If you bought me a coffee or sent me YouTube super thanks, thank you so much for that. Really appreciate that generosity. And if you're a long-term supporter, either through Patreon, where you can watch my videos advert-free, or YouTube membership, where you watch them promotion-free, or buy me a coffee membership, thank you for that long-term support. Really helps to keep me going. And here's something to put a smile on your face.